What if the very thing you're avoiding, being fully and unapologetically yourself, is the one thing that could change everything for you? In today's video, we'll look at how embracing authenticity unlocks healing, deeper relationships, and a connection to your true purpose. As is the case with all of these deep dive videos, we'll start with the psychology of the topic and then dive into a more spiritual perspective later on. As human beings, we are really up against it from a very early age when it comes to authenticity being programmed out of us. Right from the outset, we need to find a way to belong in our unit. We need to find a way to feel accepted, to feel safe. And so our brain development is attuned to connecting with our caregivers, with finding a way to fit in with our caregivers. And we are, from very early stages, from 0 through to 7 really, taking on a whole range of beliefs to help us to fit in to our family or to our community, to our unit of caregivers. And so from very early on, it's not about being praised or accepted for who we are, but who others want us to be. And that's not any fault of anyone else. It's just simply the way the society, at least Western society, is structured. That our caregivers teach us based on what they've learned, model to us based on what they've figured out. And we pick up on those cues and adjust our behavior, our personality accordingly. So from very early on, we could be taking on the role of the people pleaser, or the caregiver, or the conflict avoider, or the entertainer. And these roles are not necessarily reflective of our true essence. They are programmed into us. And shame can really keep these embedded, the dark and heavy emotion of shame, in that if we feel rejected and shamed into that feeling of rejection, we are very motivated to avoid such shame again, and therefore will engage in whatever behavior that we need to avoid feeling shame, avoid feeling rejection, and most definitely avoid feeling unloved and unsafe. And then if we go further, for those of us in Western society, most of us go to school. It continues on. The need for belonging extends into the school environment, where we need to have friends. We need to feel a part of things. We need to feel accepted. And this is an evolutionary drive, because our ancestors very much needed to fit into the tribe. Otherwise, they could die. If they were rejected from the tribe at a young age and cast out, they would die. And so this deep unconscious fear that if we are not accepted, if we are not a part of things on a deep level, we fear that we would actually die, is woven into our DNA in a very deep way. And effectively what happens is the majority, what the consensus believe is appropriate behavior, so little groups at school that decide certain fashion or certain interests or being sporty, etc., are what are acceptable and what are cool, will continue this process of programming, of shaping individuals to be a certain way that is not necessarily in alignment with who they truly wish to be. And so you can often have clusters of young people in these situations modifying themselves to fit in, and potentially others that are dulling themselves down to not draw negative attention, to sit on the fringes, to sit on the edges, so that they don't draw any attention from the bullies or the cool kids, so to speak. So this challenge of being authentic is really really quite tough from our early life experiences, from our home environments, from our school environments, and really we're in those environments, most of us, up until the age of 18. And by then, we're potentially a shadow of our true authentic self. We're too busy adapting ourselves to avoid any kind of judgment or a sense that we don't belong. And not necessarily consciously, but on a subconscious level a lot of the time. Before we go further into how to step more into our authenticity, I wanted to highlight that authenticity is not just the opposite end of conforming. So being different for the sake of being different. Because again, that would be driven by a fear motivation, a fear that if I'm not special, if I don't stand out, if I'm not impressive, then I don't have enough self-worth, or I don't have enough admiration from my peers or from the world. So authenticity certainly should not be confused with, look at me, I'm different, I'm not a sheep. It's all about aligning with who you were born to be. And we'll get into that in a deeper way a bit further on in this video. So how can we reduce being inauthentic? And as has been the theme in my other videos, I can't help but come to the work of parts, or the model that I like to use most in my work is the internal family systems model. And I should point out here that this is not just because I'm a particular fan of this model. The concept of working with parts, shadow elements, is in a number of different psychological and healing modalities throughout history, and I've just landed on internal family systems as a model that works well for me. So any model that looks into parts that are operating in the psyche and the personality based on some level of fear or some level of wounding is worthwhile engaging in to do the inner work on oneself. And so if we look at it from a parts perspective, then being inauthentic is generally a result of protective parts of the personality that seek to shield us from any kind of negative emotion. So a very easy example would be the people pleaser part. A people pleasing part quite commonly will be seeking to protect us from feeling rejected or unloved. And this may have been because we actually experienced that when we were young, that we actually had an experience where when we didn't do what a significant other, a caregiver for example, wanted us to do, we felt a sense of rejection or withdrawal of love, and that did not feel good. So we sought to develop a strategy to not have that happen again. And so doing what we believed the caregiver or that significant other wanted us to do would seem to be a good compensation to avoid having that feeling of rejection or feeling unloved again. Another example would be becoming aloof or having a part of you that is standoffish. And that aloof or standoffish part potentially got generated because there was criticism at some point in early life. And so to avoid criticism, to avoid feeling that you're being judged or not good enough or failing, not much was given away. There was a distance that was created, aloofness and standoffishness, so that there was less chance you'd be criticized. If you don't say as much, if you don't give as much away, you can't be judged. So you can see how these types of parts really are there for a very good reason. They're there to protect us, and they do a great job doing that. It's just that those parts don't necessarily need to play that same role as we get older. And they get stuck performing the same role that they learnt very early in life. And a very beautiful starting point for working with parts, for those of you who have not had any exposure to it, is to find a connection to that part of yourself. Generally, I do it as an eyes closed, internal, meditative experience. It doesn't have to be with your eyes closed, but I find it easiest to do it that way. And to tune into that part of myself. And I have had a people pleaser part. I have an aloof part. I shouldn't say had. I still have them. They've just toned down with the work, with the connection that I've formed with these parts. And by getting to know them, to getting to understand what their deeper intention was, the fact that both of those parts were only trying to help, even though they have become a bit misguided and a bit over the top, I should say, it doesn't mean that their intentions were not good. And once you can find that healthy intention, as I said, that the aloof part was just trying to avoid any criticism, and acknowledgement and appreciation can be offered to that part, it tends to soften. It tends to ease back in being acknowledged and understood, not by trying to force change upon it, just by connecting with it and showing it understanding. There's more that comes beyond that initial connection, but that is a very powerful starting point. Just by showing acceptance and connecting with these parts of ourselves, they already, without any other intervention, tend to ease up a bit and allow you, your core self, to run the show, so to speak. Now, if we do that work, if we do the parts work and then seek to go out into the world and make changes, then we can't guarantee that those parts are going to very quickly settle back and not try to interfere with the more authentic version of yourself you're trying to bring forth. So there can still be this importance around getting very clear on who you wish to be or who you know yourself to be, and taking action to follow through on being that person, even though the parts might still be a little bit hesitant and throwing up hesitation or anxiety, etc., and not necessarily letting those thoughts and feelings stop you from taking the action. Because when you think about it, technically, they're not three-dimensional. They can't actually grab the steering wheel that is your body and your words and control them. They can make it difficult at times, but technically, we can still have the free will to, I guess, push past those hesitations, those thoughts, those feelings, those parts, trying to stop us from taking the action that we know to be best for us, to be most authentic for us. And it's much easier when you've done the parts work, because those parts tend to respond well to a bit of reassurance and a reminder that, hey, it's okay, you don't need to do that anymore. Remember what we sort of spoke about, and the parts of you tend to respect that and sit back once you formed a connection. So I'd always encourage to do the parts work first, where possible. And when action starts to unfold and we start to make these changes, I guess a word of warning needs to come in here, because there'll be many people that maybe aren't accustomed to you behaving in this way. Maybe you start to speak up for yourself, for example, where you previously kept very quiet. And that could easily be misinterpreted as being aggressive or rude, because all of a sudden now you're expressing yourself. I should note at this point that people that have been passive for too long, when they do start to speak up, occasionally do overshoot the mark and it comes out aggressively. So you do need to be mindful of that. But hopefully you can find that middle ground between passive and aggressive, which is assertive. It's a nice middle ground, respect for self and others equally. So that could be a change that unfolds when someone's stepping into a greater sense of authenticity, and others aren't necessarily going to like that, or they might be confused by that. And that doesn't mean you're on the wrong path. It just means that they might need a bit of time to adjust to this version of you that's now coming forth. Or they might need some education that, look, I realise that I've been pushing my own needs down and not speaking up for myself all these years, and I hope you can appreciate that I need to start doing that now. And most people that are emotionally aware enough or respect you enough, hopefully, will allow you to do that. But there will potentially be some that have been in the dominant position and really don't like you standing up to them, and then you've got a difficult decision as to whether that relationship maintains or not. I can never advise any individual about that without knowing their situation. And even when I am working one-on-one with a client, I still like to give them the decision making because it's not my life. So you can only ever make that decision on your own whether you need to pull away from another individual. But hopefully, in a lot of cases, being your authentic self is respected by the people that you love and that love you. And that over time, you will draw to you more people that really respect you, even if it means culling some people initially, that it will draw people in. People will be drawn to that realness that you exude. They don't even necessarily know why. They will just be drawn to that sense that you are comfortable in your own skin and that there's not this efforting or this falseness about the way you express yourself. I think we tend to know when someone is trying too hard to impress or entertain or be something or someone they're not. And people will pick up on it, and most good people will tend to appreciate that. I guess one area that is important to highlight here where it can be difficult to really step into authenticity potentially could be a workplace where you've been forced into a certain role or played a certain role of being submissive and maybe changing that in the middle of being an employee could really jeopardize your work. Now, I'm not, again, advising anyone to go out and quit their job and, radically change who they are at the risk of their financial livelihood. Although I would get you to question that, is it worth it? And is there another way? Is there a way to bring your more authentic self into play in a workplace, find work that can respect who you really are rather than having to suppress who you really are? Now I'd like to shift to the more esoteric or spiritual side of this topic. And I wanted to start with looking at how authenticity is not just about expressing yourself, but it's about being aware of yourself. A deeper level of self-awareness is also a key feature of authenticity. So it's not just about saying what's on your mind, it's about knowing who you really are. And on a broad sense, I would say to you that you are a soul having a three-dimensional experience. You are working with the physical stuff, but you are not really that. That is not the essence of who you really are. You are more than that. And yes, we have to operate in that three-dimensional world and work jobs, make money, do chores, look after our kids, etc., etc. I'm not denying any of that. But as far as any of those roles or those labels being who you really are, no, it's not. It doesn't define the essence of who you are. You are a spiritual being here incarnated in physical form. And there is only one of you in existence. And that might sound very cheesy. We hear this talk about being yourself in society in general, and maybe we just flick it off because it sounds very nice but not realistic. But it's important to really just sink into that, knowing that there is only one of you in existence. You are a unique puzzle piece in the puzzle of humanity. And without you as one of the puzzle pieces, humanity is incomplete. You are here for a reason. You are meant to be here very deliberately. Even though you may not find it easy to know exactly what role you're playing or what your purpose is, I guarantee you are here for a reason. There is a purpose. And that purpose doesn't have to necessarily be going out and changing the world. But there's no accident that you're here. Creation, the universe, existence, whatever you want to call it, does not make mistakes. You incarnated for a reason. And if you're alive, it's for a reason. And so I guess a lot of people are potentially not expressing their truth because they don't quite know what it is yet. So how do we figure that out? How do we figure out our truth? Well, the paths work that I spoke of before can be a helpful process to start to kind of clear the way, to peel back these protective layers, these parts that aren't really fully reflective of who we are, the being, the essence of who we are, so that we can access what's, I guess, there underneath, or what's been there all along, what was there before we got programmed by the world, the essence of us that is just being. Call it soul, call it your essence, call it consciousness. So doing that work really helps pave the way to get access to that. I'd also recommend, there's a few different models out there that help people understand themselves, but the Gene Keys by Richard Rudd I find to be very deep and useful model for self-awareness. Human design is another one that is quite popular that some of you might be aware of already. And my understanding is that Richard Rudd started with human design and then has effectively evolved it to this other level through his intuitive knowings that have brought this model together. And you can get your free Gene Keys profile from, I think it's genekeys.com, but there's a free profile there that gives you a sense of a basic outline for potentially what you are here to do using your astrology. But it's a detailed astrological system, and I've found personally that there is a lot to it. There's a lot of deep contemplation that goes with this system, so it's seen as the middle path between a meditative approach and a focused or will-driven kind of approach, which is the contemplation path. So a sense of reading up on some understandings of how you are structured and what you came here to do based on this system, and allowing those awarenesses just to sort of sit there in the background, and not necessarily about intense memorizing, but just letting that kind of marinate in the background. So it's a beautiful system, and I'd recommend it to anyone. There's some books you have to purchase to really dive in, or courses you have to purchase to get the full rundown on each of your Gene Keys, but I found it very useful myself. And if you don't want to go that path and you just want to be a little bit more direct, then we have access to it. We have access to what our higher self, what our intuition is seeking to tell us about who we really are all the time. Our higher self is constantly trying to give us guidance on what we are truly here to do, what actions to take, which paths to go down. If we know how to listen, if we know how to quiet down and tune into that quiet knowing, that subtle voice, or those synchronicities, or just following what lights you up, that is who you really are. I'm not trying to make that sound super easy, because again, we have to live in this three-dimensional modern world. But there is this inner guidance always there, once we know how to get access to it and find it. The truth is, you know who you are, but you've just forgotten. You've always known. You don't need the answer from someone externally. You know. You just have to remember how to listen in and find out who you really are. And if you've never really tuned in, it might take some time to get past all the noise, get past the parts that are talking first, and make peace with those parts that are the busyness, are the fear-based elements, before you actually get to that inner voice that's whispering, that's trying to guide you. And when I say inner voice, that's not necessarily how it is for everyone. I don't mean that you'll always hear a voice whispering to you, but an inner knowing, a guidance, feeling, and signs. And when we live authentically, we become more emotionally alive. We're connected. Our relationships become deeper. We become more magnetic. We live with less fear, and we flow with life. So be you, because there's no one else in existence who can. Thanks for watching.